a televíznej fakulty, na ktorej pôde sa toto podujatie koná, privítala profesorku Ewu Maziersku, ktorá je autorkou vyše 30 kníh, nielen o filme, ale aj o populárnej hudbe, má veľmi široký vedecký zámer. Okrem iného napísala aj knihu Masculinities in Polish, Czech and Slovak Cinema, takže v podstate sa veľa zaoberala práve aj českou a slovenskou kinematografiou a je tiež šéfredaktorka jedného, respektíve asi aj najvýznamnejšieho zahraničného anglofónneho časopisu pre filmové štúdia Studies in Eastern European Cinema a je tiež profesorkou na univerzite v Central Lancashire vo Veľkej Británii. Rada by som teraz odovzdala slovo pani profesorke Mazierskej.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jana, and other colleagues for inviting me, and thank you for coming. And I will talk today about canons of Eastern European cinema and the place of Eastern European films in other film canons. I must warn you that what I will say is not particularly academic, and the explanation of that is that basically there is no literature about Eastern European film canons. So what I'm doing here is largely based on my observations, on my experience, and it's informed by what I've read about film canon at large. If you find my thesis problematic, and this might be the case, I hope it will be an opportunity to correct me and have a discussion on this topic. So what I would like to talk is first provide some definition of a canon, then I will talk about national canons, then regional Eastern European canons, and finally I will talk about Eastern European films in international, let's say, Western canons. The structure is such that there will be an element of overlap and repetition, and I want to apologize for that in advance. So when we talk about canons of Eastern European cinema, we immediately encounter two issues which need clarifying. One is the shape of Eastern Europe. So the natural question which is asked in this relation is whether we take into account films belonging to the old Soviet bloc, either with or without the Soviet Union and later Russia. In Studies of Eastern European Cinema, the journal which I edit with colleagues, we decided not to include research on Russia, but I will actually here also talk about Russian canons. And then there is a question of the meaning of canon. So let's start with that. So initially, a canon was an authoritative list of books accepted as Holy Scripture. And later, in relation to culture, this was defined as a body of works considered culturally important, as established and reinforced by the work of cultural institutions, education, the media, and so on. So why canons are needed? I think the main reason is pragmatic. We just cannot study everything. We need to make a choice of what is important, what we will focus on, in order not to lose time on works which are mediocre or untypical, and to be able to communicate with people sharing the same interests and working in the same discipline. So we need some kind of, body of work which we can all, examine. Canons, we can say, also work as shortcuts. When we mention canonical films, we communicate more than our knowledge and admiration of these films. So there is inevitably a question: who decides that a given work is a Holy Scripture in a specific cultural field? So establishment of canons is always not only a matter of quality of works chosen for canonization, although we believe it's the case, but also of politics, of power relations over the choice of such works. And it's not an accident that one of the first seminal works on film canons, Janet Steiger's article, The Politics of Film Canons, has politics in its title. So in the next parts of my talk, I will actually devote much attention to this politics, and less to art, actually. I will focus on politics rather than art. So the question is, who decides about canonization of films? So we can say that they are largely specialists, archivists, film historians, academics, journalists, festival programmers. And the second category we can say are filmmakers, because they are involved in canon formation by choosing films to be quoted, reworked, alluded to, satirized, and in this way becoming privileged points of reference, pulled out from the rest of cinema predecessors. I will argue that since the period known as postmodernism, the role of filmmakers increased in this respect, and nowadays viewers very often learn about canonical films through films which reference them. So as ideal fathers, these selected films are given homage or are rebelled against. And Steiger mentions two aspects of politics of canonization. One is admission, the other is selection. So the first thing to do to create canon is to enter films into canons. And the first issue around it was which films deserve to be canonized because of their artistic work. So this was a politics of opening up the established set of arts to a newcomer, to moving pictures. So the first film theorists such as Rachel Lindsay, Hugo Münsterberg, Rudolf Arnheim, and so on, typify this project. So their question is, which films deserve to be described as artistic? And once they mentioned the film, they started to be they start to reappear in other film, histories. So politics of selection comes into play where enough films are admitted and some films need to be removed to make place for new entrants. So we can say the politics of admission always characterized the early stage of canonization. The politics of selection refers to later stage of canonization. So when canons change, so this is the question, the next question, why, once we've created a canon, why we cannot stick with it? We cannot, because new films are made. But I will say that major changes in canon happen for two principal reasons, not just because the body of films grows. One is due to wider political changes, and they play a particularly important part in canons of Eastern European cinema. And the second factor are changes in cinema itself. So new films, but also new genres, new styles, and technological inventions. And now if we move to the question of Eastern European films, the first thing which can be noticed is that all the authors involved in the early canonization mentioned by Steiger came from the West. So somehow Eastern European films were practically excluded from these early canons. And obviously there are further repercussions for that. You know, if you are not in early canons, then it's more difficult to, you know, be incorporated. So the politics of admission somehow dominates the politics of selection. So we can say that Eastern Europe lagged behind in this respect. And such a situation has wider historical roots. Many Eastern European countries came into existence only after the First World War and needed time to build their industries. They also lacked critics treating their domestic production seriously. And here, this is an observation largely taken from, you know, Polish film criticism, which I sort of studied some years ago. And what is characteristic about this early Polish film criticism is that its attitude to local production was negative. Karol Iżykowski, the most famous Polish film historian and critic, was openly hostile to domestic film production. So he used many examples of Polish cinema, but only to dismiss them. And the change of system from capitalism to state socialism after the Second World War resulted in a perception that new countries were born after 1945. And this again affected in a major way attitude to canonization, namely that cinematic production of interwar years was deemed not worthy of canonization. In Poland, this was really a dominant approach, that all these films were bad with very few exceptions, so they are not really worthy of studying. They were really treated in a very dismissive way. And I know that it was the case in some other European countries, maybe not across the whole bloc, but certainly this was a common phenomenon. And now, if we compare Eastern Europe, understood as the part of this region without Russia, we see that there are differences here. So, from this perspective, there was a difference between the Soviet Union and countries such as Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria, and so on. Because having been established thanks to October Revolution, we can say this Russian canon or Soviet Union canon had a longer history. And this approach also affected international take on canons. Early Soviet films such as Battleship Potyomkin, directed by Eisenstein, or Man with a Movie Camera, directed by Dziga Wiertow, are included in international canons, while early Polish, Czech, or Hungarian films are almost never included. So this is a big difference. And then the end of Stalinism and rejection of state socialism resulted in a further delay of canon formations in Eastern Europe, because socialist realist films, which were generally not concerned with authorship and arthouseness, and I will talk about it later on, were not deemed worthy of canonization. And this was because by this point films worthy of canonization had to belong to art and be seen as personal expressions of their directors and be at least mildly oppositional dissident. Again, I will talk about it more in due course. They also had to be in some ways universal. And I will argue that in comparison with Eastern Europe, American and Western European cinema do not have such dramatic ruptures. Obviously, American cinema also sort of broke because of the cinema, industry change, but historically, I would say it's much more continuous than cinemas in our part of the world. And so my conclusion is here that the first and most important period in the history of Eastern European cinemas, from which films were admitted to national canons, were the period of the new waves, lasting in different countries from the mid-50s to mid-60s. And the films produced during this period by filmmakers such as Andrzej Wajda, Roman Polański, Juraj Jakubisko, Elocha Weta, Vera Chytilowa, Miloš Forman, Miklos Jancho, Dusan Makavejew, Aleksander Petrovich, the list can obviously go on and on, fit perfectly these boxes. They were in many ways similar to films produced in Western countries, most importantly France. And in its approach to canonization, New Wave films, Eastern European critics, I will also argue, were similar to their Western counterparts. And here it's worth quoting Serge Daney, who was editor of Cahiers du Cinéma, and he, in conversation with Godard, which is included in Godard's Histoire du Cinéma, claims that Godard's generation, which means roughly those born between the mid-20s and mid-30s, was best placed to create cinema's history, hence canon, because they were the first to experience cinema as something which has a linear history. So he mentioned that they were aware that Rossellini was after Griffith and Visconti after Renoir as much in a chronological as a logical sense. Earlier this was impossible because of factors such as lack of access to films, exacerbated by the war and the low quality of film criticism. After Godard, according to Daney, after Godard sort of symbolically, after this generation, it became again difficult to create film history, which means canon, because suddenly there were too many films. So today, which means today when Daney mentioned it, but I would say, this means from this moment, from the late 90s, let's say, it is problematic to talk about film history with any authority because one lacks an insight into total production of films. And this I kind of, experience from my own perspective and that of colleagues, there is almost nobody who has somehow a sense what is going on in cinema. People really don't want to talk about it, while I think colleagues who are like 30 years older than me, they had this authority. Godard does not agree with Daney, claiming that after Godard, in a sense, there are more films but less cinema, he claims. Expansion of film industry is not accompanied by production of masterpieces. Again, this is a point maybe which is worth discussing, but again, we often find this view. On the contrary, there are less good films from the 90s than there are from the 50s and the 60s. I just quoted, is it true or not? It's partly a matter of opinion, but partly a matter of knowledge, which I lack. And I think moving again, trying to put it in the context of Eastern Europe, I would say that the rule sketched by Daney and Godard applies largely to the history of Polish cinema and some other Eastern European cinemas, such as Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, in a sense that Eastern European film directors were often cinephiles and they had a profound sense of film history. If we sort of read interviews or memoirs of directors such as Polański, Forman, Makavejew, they really knew a lot about film history and they were very much invested in it. And I would say this refers even more to film critics. Again, in Poland, I don't know much about many other countries. The leading film historians were Francophilic critics such as Bolesław Michałek and Aleksander Jackiewicz, whose taste was very similar to that promoted in Cahiers du Cinéma in the 50s and 60s. And this especially refers to Michałek, whose role as a canonizer was strengthened by him writing the first book on Polish cinema addressed to the English-speaking audience, published in 1988. And I would say the situation in Czechoslovakia was similar, at least in a wider international context, because the first book in English about Czechoslovak cinemas was written, as far as I'm aware, by Peter Hames, whose taste in cinemas again was similar to Michałek. And his chief interests were new wave films of, former Chytilova, etc. And he knows very well, still is alive, European modernist films. So he, again, you will use it as his main point of reference. And this will be largely true also about Yugoslav cinema. So again, Eastern Europe, I would argue, this sort of narrowly understood, is different in this respect from Russia, as Russian cinema appear to have a less, apart from having this history of, these early masterpieces, Formalist and so on, Eisenstein, Wierto, Kuleshev and so on. At the same time, I would say it has a less distinct new wave than in Eastern European counterparts. The only exception is probably Tarkovsky, probably the most famous Soviet filmmaker since Eisenstein. So now if we look at the question of politics of admission and politics of selection, I would say that as a result of the canon formation beginning later, the politics of selection played a smaller role in Eastern Europe than in Western countries. So the shifts are, I would say, much more subtle than, let's say, in American cinema. In particular, new wave films and its directors are still privileged in consideration of national canons. And we can see it in new books produced in this area. So I will argue that what we observe is almost, I would say, near freezing of Eastern European canon. So I would say that the canon of Eastern European films is growing slightly rather than being substantially, reconstructed, confirming the observation made by Godard that the corpus of films is growing, but cinema is proportionally shrinking. And now I will look a bit at criteria of canonization in Eastern European cinema. I touched upon it earlier, but let's look at it slightly more in detail. So I would say the first criteria is focus on authors as opposed to films. So this reflects the French author theory, the specificity of the organization of film production in socialist countries with semi-autonomous film studios and the split of national cinema into popular and art house supported by the party, which was a reflection of the end of social realism. So it's sort of, canons are largely not about, this film or that film. Canons are more about films by, let's say, Jakubisko, Forman and Chytilova and Makavejev and Wajda and so on. So in relation to Polish cinema, Michałek wrote, in Poland, the creative position of a director is considerably enhanced. He's no more manipulator of mise-en-scène, nor simply an executor of a producer's projects, not yet a combination of a technician, businessman, organizer, a paradigm familiar to Americans. So he's much more than that. He's the really, the true author of what we see on screen. So the question arises whether the focus on new wave directors highlights the artistry, importance, and distinctiveness of Eastern European cinema, or rather obscures its value by rendering it similar to films made in Western Europe. I will suggest that the second is the case, and this results in Eastern European films being currently squeezed between Western art house films and admittedly more exotic and deserving films coming from other marginalized communities, especially the global South. And the next criteria is oppositional stance. So the second criterion is a critical attitude to the authorities and the dominant ideology or its implementation. So the bulk of canonized directors were at some stage dissidents, and many left their countries. at least it's how their work is read. Whether it's always the case, it's you know, maybe not always the case, but if we take, you know, the criticism around their work, it's very much, you know, focused on that, you know, Macavé, Wajda, and so on. Even if some of these directors got, you know, large budgets, like in Poland, Wajda really was actually a pampered director by the authorities, you know. He made films with, you know, thousands of extras and, you know, and horses and so on. A lot of, you know, the majority of, you know, historical discourse on Wajda is sort of, you know, how he was kind of independent and really critical of, you know, of the dominant ideology. And the next criterion, I would say, art houselessness, namely breaking with the zero-style rules of Hollywood cinema. I don't go into details because probably you know what I mean. There are very often films with, you know, open ending and somehow, you know, characters thrown into, you know, certain, you know, situations and you know, narrative is also often fragmented and so on. So this will be also something which helps to canonize these films if the films are made according to this, you know, recipe. So if we again now look at the history, obviously the next rupture worth mentioning is the end of state socialism. So this was the time when industries in Eastern Europe changed. There was a weaker state protection and a more entrepreneurial spirit brought into film industry. However, again, I will argue that these changes did not affect substantially Eastern European canons. It is still based on the idea of authorship, and not many authors emerged after the end of state socialism, able to attract international attention. Perhaps the most important case is Bela Tar, followed maybe in the recent years by Paweł Pawlikowski from Poland. However, Tar is slowly losing its place in international canons. He slipped considerably on the sight and sound pole, and Pawlikowski has not reached it yet. Maybe he wouldn't reach. And now, if we look at Eastern European films in wider canons, if we look at Eastern European canon as a sort of regional canon rather than the sum of national canons, I will argue that it hardly exists, as historically there has been little interest in cinema of the neighbors in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe, from this perspective, is rather fragmented among Eastern European scholars who are largely West-oriented. So, for example, if you look at the work of these Polish critics, you know, Michałek and Jackiewicz, whom I mentioned, but also some minor critics. Basically, if we read what they were writing, they were mainly writing either about Polish cinema, Western cinema, or Russian cinema. The Eastern European cinema almost didn't exist for them, so they weren't interested in that. And they are dead. We cannot really ask them what was the case, but I think this was probably partly due to having rather dismissive attitude to Eastern Europe, while having to somehow reckon themselves with Russia. And there were also as far as I know, no institutions during the period of state socialism willing and able to promote regional identity and lobby international institutions on behalf of Eastern European cinema. This is the sort of, you know, paradox that we were in one bloc, but basically as cinema was concerned, there was no really, you know, much promotion of the work in this bloc. And I think probably the same is about literature. Each country somehow went together. And I would say this is slightly changing, and this event, I think, demonstrates that, as there is more international cooperation between scholars across the borders, especially between those coming from Czechia, Slovakia, and Poland on one hand, Romania and Hungary on the other, Balkan states, Baltic countries, and so on. Nevertheless, still most work is done within the national framework. And there is, as far as I learned from the Polish and Slovenian archives, there's little cooperation between film archives in Eastern Europe, and there is really no drive to somehow promote regional cinema. I'm aware of time, but I started a bit later. So the next question is the role of the place of Eastern European films in global canons. And here I used 2 criteria to look at it. One is presence of such films in histories of global cinema and sub-histories of different genres, considering different aspects of films such as sound and music. So I just looked, actually this is what interests me, and I'm kind of very sort of sensitive to it. When I read these things, I sort of check, are these examples from Eastern European cinema ever used? And then the second criterion results in the sight and sound polls, and the last was recently. So I would say that Eastern European cinema has been historically seen as minor cinema, attracting less attention and receiving less recognition than Hollywood cinema and Western European cinema. Eastern European films are rarely chosen for discussions highlighting specific phenomena, such as feminist cinema, biographical films, the use of color, and so on. So if we look randomly on these topics, the examples used here will typically come from other, cinemas. Obviously, there are exceptions, like, Three Colors by Kieślowski will be sometimes used to discuss colors, but it will be very specific case. And again, there is difference here between Soviet Union and Russia and Eastern Europe, because Battleship Potemkin and Man with a movie camera feature in histories of world cinema and important polls. So Eisenstein's films was ranked number 1 with 32 votes when the Festival Mondial du Film in Belgium asked 63 film professionals around the world, mostly the directors, to vote for the best films of the half-century in 1951. Until 2002, it also found itself in the first 10 of Sight and Sound poll, being at 4th place in the first poll in 1952. And there were other films, from Soviet Union which were in these polls. And I would say that films from Eastern Europe do not have a comparable position. Best fared films by Roman Polanski, particularly Chinatown, although its Polishness is problematic. But, if we regard films by Eastern European directors as coming from Eastern Europe, this will be the case. So Polanski's high status is also reflected in a large number of volumes dedicated to his films, exceeding those of other directors from Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, even Eisenstein. But again, we can say there is the complex reasons for that, not all related to art. So over the years which have passed since the first Sight and Sound poll, Russian Soviet films lost their high position, while Eastern European films remained underrepresented. I would say they are much less represented as time passes than in the past. And this I will attribute to 2 factors. One is this sort of what I describe as politics of inclusion, paradoxically, and the second is moral turn in art. And inclusion amounts to including art of members of groups which were historically absent or underrepresented in canons, such as those coming from women, the global south, or disabled people. This is something which we observe in academia and everywhere. You have to bring the minority to the center. Sometimes it's linked to postmodernism, this sort of decentering. The center was the program of postmodernism. And moral turn leads to assessing work according to a personal conduct of an artist or a group they represent. And I would say here, Eastern Europe with Russia are losing because of that. So the politics of inclusion results in Eastern European films having to compete with films from more underrepresented regions than was the case in the previous decades. So they're losing in this competition, as demonstrated by the last Sight and Sound polls from 2012 and 2022, while films from Eastern European and Russia went down and disappeared. So, for example, Battleship Potemkin went down significantly, Satan Tango went down, Kieślowski's Decalogue disappeared. And we can say that their places were taken by films made by filmmakers coming from the global south, more or less. There's also an issue of genres, like, animated films, for example, are now on sight and sound poles, while they weren't, 20 years ago. And I would say the only winner in this shift is Daisies by Chytilova, which went up and quite high last time. But I would say this is thanks to representing the represented group, namely female filmmakers, and belonging to this sort of classics of feminist cinema. So moral turn, I would say, was most likely a factor in a poor performance of Russian films in the last Sight and Sound poll, both historical, such as Battleship Potemkin, and a complete absence of Russian films made in the post-communist period. By contrast, in 2012, 22 Man with a Movie Camera was holding its high place, which effectively means going up. This can be in a large part attributed to the Russian-Ukraine war, which resulted in a boycott of Russian cultural products as much contemporary as those from the past, including music by Tchaikovsky. So what I wanted to say, that Battleship Potemkin goes down because it's seen as Russian, although, Eisenstein came actually from Latvia, but he's not seen this way. Why Man with a Movie Camera is increasingly seen as a, Ukrainian film, and has this sort of extra status attributed to it. And assessing work according to a personal conduct of an artist or her personal characteristic was also probably a factor in Polanski's Chinatown slipping out from the main list last time, only remaining on the director's list. And this is to do with him sort of, being condemned for his personal contact. So I'm coming to an end. So what are my predictions? I would say that there will be further decline of Russian and Eastern European films on the list of global canons. This is the sort of sad, prediction for somebody who is invested in promoting these films and doing its history. But the process can be partly halted by new ways of conducting its history, by linking it to international paradigms and trends, such as feminist cinema, haptic cinema, posthumanism, small cinemas, intermediality. And I know that there are colleagues, here and elsewhere who, Andreas here, who is very interested in small cinemas, who sort of, use examples from Eastern Europe to, bring attention to these films in this new context. And for example, it's likely that Jerzy Skolimowski's EO film, which was recently nominated for Oscar, will find its way to books written about other issues than Eastern European cinema. My own, it's small kind of experience about this film is that it sort of looked not as an Eastern Europe film, but in this context of, posthumanism and so on. Thanks to inscribing itself into new ways of thinking about cinema. So, in conclusion, in Russian cinema canons, we observe dominance of early films informed by the ideology of socialism. There is focus on auteurs and new wave films in national cinemas from Eastern Europe. We also observe underrepresentation of Eastern European cinema in global canons, and its loss of the old relatively high position due to being incorporated into larger units such as European cinema. And finally, recently, exclusion of Russian films in global canons due to losing the sympathy vote and gaining the hostility vote. Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you for your attention. And if there are any questions, I will be happy to answer if any comments. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Eva, very much for your lecture, which was very full of interesting ideas. I am sure that there will be many questions in the audience. Am I right? Sú nejaké otázky z publika? Výborne.
Budem po slovensky.
Yeah.
Chcem sa opýtať, že keď hovoríte o tom, že tá že tá ruská kinematografia stráca sympatie, aj keď si myslím, že to je prískoro, aby to tak výrazne bolo vidieť.
Trošku pomalšie.
Aha. Spomínate ten akoby nejaký morálny aspekt tej pozície v kánone a že tá ruská kinematografia vďaka teda invázii stráca. Získava napríklad ukrajinská kinematografia? Je to vidieť? Ten záujem, teda aj akoby ten morálny záujem a tú rekanonizáciu tak rýchlo, trebárs?
Yes, I think it's, as I said, the fact that, man with a movie camera is so canonized, doesn't lose this position while Battleship Potemkin loses, speaks for itself. Okay, this will be easier for me. Speaks for itself, but for that to happen, first of all, you need to have like a better differentiation between Ukrainian and Soviet cinema. As the case with everything, with music is the same. And as I'm not a specialist in this area, but I know that this process somehow started. In the last 20 years, we observe greater interest in, Ukrainian cinema as a sort of specific paradigm. The same also refers to, Estonian cinema or Latvian cinema or, Lithuanian cinema. It's more looked like, Lithuanian. Soviet cinema is now more looked at as Lithuanian cinema rather than Soviet cinema. But, as I said, this process only started relatively, not a long time ago. So it has to be somehow, more advanced, yes. And the second thing, the films need to be brought into wider attention. And it's not so easy to do, even in the context of Eastern Europe. For example, for a different, event, I interviewed somebody who is, programming archive cinema in Warsaw. And he said that actually it's very difficult now to show Ukrainian cinema in the cinema because the copyrights are mainly in Soviet hands. And because of the war, the Russians wouldn't release it, yes? So it's actually much more difficult to show this, Ukrainian Soviet films now than it was like, let's say, 10 years ago, just before the war, yes? And also, you need to take into account that process of canonization takes time. You wouldn't change canon from day to day, yes? So I would say, and it needs also what I mentioned, like quite a strong effort of, critics and both, national and international. You need this kind of, work to be done. And I know that, for example, there are kind of conferences going on about, Ukrainian war also in terms of, culture and media. Probably they will play this role eventually. But I think I would say they are more focused on the war rather than like rewriting, cultural history. I don't know if I answered your question.
Ale ja to cítim v tých súčasných podobách umenia, že je na súčasných festivaloch sa tej ukrajinskej produkcii alebo vo výtvarnom umení je zrazu nejaký ten priestor dávaný povedzme tým ukrajinským umelcom, buď tým teda emigrovaným, alebo že je tam nejaký druh takej akoby umeleckej rekompenzácie za tú vojnu.
Yes, I agree with you, and this happens, but I'm just saying, canonization is not such a fast process, yes? So the fact that, for example, let's say in the last year, maybe, there were, I don't know, 10 times or 50 times more Ukrainian films than in analogous period 10 years ago, is not enough to sort of, change canon in such a way to bring these films to canons. Canons need this kind of time work, so to speak.
Ešte jeden vstup, že ale hovoríte, že ten hostility vote už funguje. To znamená, negatívne to funguje rýchlejšie ako pozitívne?
Yes, very much the case. It's much easier to sort of, stop showing, Eisenstein or Tchaikovsky or, whatever, than bring something new to the public attention, and this process needs to be really, sustained. So this is what I will argue. Yes, Katarina?
Hello, thank you, Eva, for your lecture and for, I think, fascinatingly explaining how writing or rewriting or constructing of history is happening. And I don't want to be greedy or feisty, but I have 3 questions that are maybe somehow interconnected. And the first being, if you would consider, or at least this happened in Slovak cinema or writing on the history of Slovak cinema, if you would consider recontextualization or recanonization of cinema after the turn. This happened in Slovak cinema or Czechoslovak cinema very much because, as you know, many film directors were not able to shoot films or were only able to make documentary films, etc. I mean these new wave canonized directors who are nowadays canonized. And this canonization often happened only after 1989. So these films or these works were put in front or pushed forward. That's one question. The other question is linked to what you have said about the new waves or the canonization of new waves. If you would say that being part of a group of a larger wave or film movement, you see, if that helps canonization, as you know, as a collective entrance, if this is also a factor. And the third question is your argumentation of underrepresentation of Eastern European cinema was largely based on the sight and sound vote, which from my point of view is understandable also as a, the reason being it's an English or it's a British magazine. So I would definitely agree that if we want to, create or promote Eastern European canons, we definitely have to contextualize it in global concepts with cinema from other parts of world. But do you think that maybe we should also work on canonization of Eastern European cinema on other platforms than those coming from Western world? Because from what I see, the world is still sort of divided. There, I mean, of course, we are not East and West in such a simplified way, but very much in practicalities, there is, this division cultural. I perceive it. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe I start with the second question because I remember it better. And I think about sight, and I agree with you that we should sort of, why not create a canon of Eastern European cinema and use sort of, events like that to work on that. But I said the second criterion for me was the sort of presence of Eastern European films in these other histories. I think this is perhaps, equally important, and then you could see this underrepresentation. But regarding the Sight and Sound poll, it's true this is a British magazine, but they sort of pride themselves of being very representative. And, in the last poll, I think they invited over 2,000 critics and, people who were voting. It was really very large representation. And I was voting so far twice, but, and I didn't look so much and, who voted how. But, after the vote in 2012, I was actually at the event in Poland, and a colleague made a kind of like research about how Poles voted in this poll. And it turned out that Poles almost exclusively voted for un-Polish films. Yeah, I think I was then exception, because I think I voted for two, and I voted for Makavejev. I was kind of patriotic, but in a Polish sense, in a wider sense, well, most Poles completely ignored Polish films. So I would say the issue of the results of these polls is not so much, I would say, that they favor Anglophone critics, because when they favored it in the 50s, actually they chose Battleship Potemkin as the best film. Now when the wider, I think, poll is chosen, what happens that actually Eastern Europeans rarely vote for Eastern European films, while those who come from Africa, who weren't present in the 50s, while now you have a lot of, critics and filmmakers from these countries, they actually vote for African films, yes? So I would say this is more of a problem, this somehow having perhaps, more positive attitude to cinema where we come from. And I would say here, as Poland is concerned, it's still like Iżykowski, he uses Polish examples as sort of, negative examples. There is a tendency to be somehow more critical towards our own cinema than to, other cinema. But I agree with you that working to promote cinema and looking more into issue of our national canons and being invested in canonization, sort of consciously investing will help. And as for the first question, now I kind of forgot about it, but
rewriting of history after the turn, after 1989.
Yes,
and recanonization of several directors who had political problems.
Yes, I think, I don't know really how it's going on, but I would say it slightly changes. But for example, in Poland, there was a large history of Polish cinema written after the change by Tadeusz Lubelski, who is the most respected historian of Polish cinema, and his approach to cinema is very much about masterpieces. Yes. So this again, and this is the book which every student of Polish cinema is reading. There is obviously what I observe is greater interest in sort of, para-cinema and so on and so forth, and, cinema which doesn't exist, namely, films which never went to production, sort of marginal films. But whether it will change the canon, I don't know. Again, maybe, more time is needed, for example, to sort of thinking about, Rumzeis. Yes, you had this Rumzeis as being a film which really, deserves number 2 in Eastern European canon, because, it was watched in the whole of Eastern Europe or something like that. Do you know what I mean? So again, maybe time is needed to change the whole thinking about cinema, and I even don't know if I agree with that so much, with this sort of kind of concept of decentering the center, in the sense of bringing all these, marginal films into the centers, because I'm myself very much in love with these new wave films. So if I want to be honest, I really, like most of these films, yes, the sort of, Makavejev and Foreman and so on. I just think these films are so great. They will be always great. I always love them. I can rewatch them many times, and not necessarily some sort of, marginal film, do you know what I mean? Or indeed many films made after 1989. Some good films were made, but I think, I personally love these films most. And this obviously shows my sort of being old-fashioned, but, this is how it is.
And about the collective aspects, if being part of a film movement, if that helps, or if it's a factor in canonization.
Yeah, I agree with it completely, that, waves are always noticeable, yes, why the work of individual directors is much less visible. I mean, certainly the fact that, French New Wave still attracts so much attention, it's because it was wave. It saw itself as wave. It sold itself as wave. So I think it's a crucial aspect. Yeah, Andrea.
Thank you so much for the lecture. I would like to go back to the very beginning of your presentation. You mentioned that the very important forum of canonization, that you are an editor of studies in Eastern European cinema, the journal. You decided with your colleagues not to include Russian cinema. And I wonder, could you speak a bit about that decision? And I would be also very interested in how do you see your position within the canonization of Eastern European cinema as an editor and as an important forum?
I think so. When we set up this journal, the main reason of excluding Russian cinema wasn't sort of political in a narrow sense. The main reason was that there was already so many journals devoted to, you know, Russian culture, and there was a journal of, you know, Soviet and Russian cinema. So, you know, we just thought, you know, there is so much space already carved for, you know, Russian culture, you know, that it will be too much, or, you know, that will also sort of confuse the, you know, readers and those who submit it. And I think our approach, or my approach, you know, I wasn't the first editor, it was John Cunningham who started, but somehow I sort of thought that it's important to look at the cinema as a whole, and rather than as sort of ghettos of national cinemas. So I sort of made the decision we wouldn't devote any issues, let's say, to Czech cinema or Polish cinema or anything like that, yes? That we will try to look at the cinema from different perspective. So we had over the years issues devoted to various directors, so we were a bit in this approach of canonization, you know, through focus on directors. We had issues about Chytilova, which was a double issue, and about Makavejev and Zhilnik and Wojciech Haas. Mainly we wanted to actually look at the work of directors who weren't so well known, and for example, there were no books in English about them. So for example, for this reason, we did an issue on Makavejev, because there was no book on Makavejev, despite, you know, or for many years there were no book of Makavejev, despite him being very well known. So I think this was the sort of approach, and rather try to look at it from the perspective of various, you know, aspects, like, you know, sports cinema, let's say, or, you know, you know, housing in Eastern European cinema, partly also to find, you know, new films. But obviously, you know, what we do is mainly what we get, yes? So this also shows how, you know, how people who wrote about the cinema approach it, and I would say still most of them approach it from national perspective. And this is fine by me, because this is also how I look at cinema. So, you know, you cannot really force people to somehow forget about, you know, that you are, you know, Slovak film historian and try to do something else, yes? And we obviously also use the advantages of being in a specific position, yes? If you live in Hungary and read in Hungary, it's obviously much, and have access to all Hungarian films and stuff written in Hungarian, it's rather obvious that you will. Bulgarian cinema, because, you know, this will require knowing language, for example, or maybe not require, but, you know, will be additional advantage. So I think the national approach is natural, and I'm not really, you know, criticizing it. Yes, you can somehow modify it, and I always say it's good to somehow extend your horizon and just not only write about your national cinema, but writing about one's national cinema is nothing wrong for me. Yeah, so.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one question. If not, maybe I will try to ask you in
okay. Oh, yeah.
Slovak. Okay.
Okay.
Rada by som sa opýtala na to, že... Aha, pardon. Rada by som sa opýtala na tézu, ktorú ste v podstate vo svojej prednáške mali o tom, že východoeurópske filmové archívy málo spolupracujú medzi sebou, lebo samozrejme v československom prostredí máme tú skúsenosť, že Český Národný filmový archív spolupracuje so Slovenským filmovým archívom, takže keby ste možno vysvetlili túto myšlienku hlbšie. A potom ešte ďalšia vec ma napadla v súvislosti s tým, že východoeurópski filmoví kritici sa málo zaujímali o iné východoeurópske kinematografie, lebo ja mám napríklad, nemám k tomu urobený žiaden výskum, ale myslím si, že napríklad juhoslovanská alebo poľská kinematografia, o nej bol vždy veľký záujem v Československu od tých 60. rokov a potom aj ďalej. Lebo práve poľský film Morálneho nepokoja alebo juhoslovanský film, či už išlo o novú vlnu alebo tie ďalšie vlny s príchodom Pražskej školy napríklad, tak boli vnímané ako baštia nejakého kritickejšieho premýšľania o kinematografii.
Okay, so in the first question, I didn't say they don't collaborate at all, yes? I'm saying that there is not much collaboration, and also I would say it has to be qualified because, you know, Czech and Slovak, you know, countries were once one country, and, you know, historically, you know, this encourages collaboration, and the same within Yugoslavia, yes? But, for example, there is practically no collaboration between, let's say, Polish and Bulgarian, you know, film archives and so on. So this is you know, there is certainly little, while there's historically was quite a lot between Polish and German and French, yes? So from this perspective, the archives were more Western-oriented than, you know, Eastern-oriented. And as for, you know, critics appreciating certain, you know, movements, this also has to be sort of, you know, qualified. And, you know, certainly one exception which was mentioned whenever I talk to people was, you know, Czech comedies. Yes, the Czech comedies were sort of appreciated across the whole bloc. But maybe this was partly the sort of like phenomenon of you know, popularity, which had to, you know, affected critics, yes, and this is still the case, yes, when I talked again to programmer of you know, Polish illusion cinema, they said, you know, if they show a program of Czech comedies, classical comedies, people will still go, yeah. So it's not like, you know, completely. I'm saying my talk is really painting with a very wide brush. So, you know, there was little space for, you know, nuance and, you know, exceptions. If I would want to do it, it would be probably twice as, you know, long. But I just wanted to, you know, sketch the main tendency, and I would say the tendency was certain lack of appreciation, and especially, you know, in relation to these very influential critics. And, you know, and early historians, because if you look at the situation now, you will find, like, you know, certainly in Poland, there are several colleagues who write about Czech cinema. Yeah, and I think the last, recently, I think a reward for, in Poland, I think the best first book was given to Grażyna Świętochowska, who wrote a history of Czech, who actually wrote a book about New Wave, to be honest, yes, Czech New Wave. So this was certainly, you know, appreciated, and she's not the only one. There are more, you know, people who write about Czech cinema, many more now than, let's say, you know, 40, 50 years ago. So the situation, you know, changes. But also changes unevenly. I, for example, don't know about any, you know, research on, let's say, Bulgarian cinema outside of Bulgaria. Albania is maybe attracts a bit of, you know, more attention. It's slightly also to do with like, you know, film which makes you know, becomes famous, or, you know, Romanian cinema obviously attracted quite a lot attention recently, but whether it will be sustained. I think what is important is the interest which doesn't fade. As I said, canonization is a long process. You don't change canon from day to day. So canon must go beyond certain fashions and beyond this sort of, sympathy votes which we observe. Okay?
Thank you very much. Možno ešte jedna úplne posledná otázka.
Yeah.
A už koniec? Dobre,
Okay,
tak.
okay.
So thank you very much. and
Thank you.
Thank you
For your
having me.
attention. So probably I can unwind myself. Okay. No, I think that's it, and I just take my pen drive, and then that's it. So, was it not too long, or no? Was it on?
Perfectly. Perfectly
Timed, okay,
Totally
great.
perfect.
Because as I said, I sort of thought it will be for about 30, 35
Actually, I
minutes.
wanted to discuss more and more.
Okay.
but they
No,
said,
I think it's just. I wonder how to close it.
maybe they will. You have to push out.
Yeah, I think maybe you just take out without closing it. But it's better
Yeah,
to
but-
close the
yeah.
presentation. Okay.
I think.
Oh, you know
left.
how to?
Let me. Actually, I don't
Okay.
understand.
If not, I
this.
just take it out.
No, I.
Or maybe.
Okay.
Sorry. So, do you know how to close the presentation?
Neviem prezentáciu.
How to close the presentation? Can take this pen drive. Okay. Okay.
Okay,
Okay. So, no.
Sorry. You need to
Okay.
close.
Okay,
And
and
no,
then-
no. Eject.
Okay. Okay.
And
Thank you
now.
very much. Thank you. So now I'm free. Okay.